Welcome back to Reddit Whispers. 20 years. 20 years is a long time to build a life with someone, to weave your existence so tightly around another person that you can't tell where you end and they begin. It's 2 decades of shared breakfasts and inside jokes, of weathering financial storms and celebrating small victories, of raising children from helpless infants into young adults with lives of their own. 20 years of assuming you know the person sleeping beside you better than you know yourself. And then, one Tuesday evening in late October, with the scent of rain and fallen leaves heavy in the air, you realize you don't know them at all. It started, as these things often do, with a conversation that felt both utterly mundane and seismically significant. Sarah was quiet during dinner, pushing her food around her plate with a fork, a little furrow in her brow that I'd come to associate with work stress or a looming bill. I asked her what was wrong, expecting the usual litany of office politics or a complaint about the leaking faucet I'd promised to fix for the past month. But she just shook her head, a faint, sad smile playing on her lips. "We need to talk, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Those 4 words, the cliché of 1,000 movie breakups, hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. My first thought, childishly, was that she'd found out about the expensive golf clubs I'd bought and hidden in the back of the garage. Or maybe she was unhappy about me working late so often. I ran through a mental checklist of my recent transgressions, trying to pinpoint the one that had finally pushed her over the edge. But nothing I could come up with seemed to warrant the profound sadness in her eyes. We went into the living room, the one we'd painted a warm, inviting yellow just a few years ago, and sat on the sofa where we'd spent countless nights watching movies and cuddling after the kids were in bed. The silence stretched on, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that had always been a comforting backdrop to our life, but now felt like a countdown to some unknown catastrophe. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. She told me she'd been unhappy for a long time, that she felt like she was suffocating, playing a role she'd been cast in but had never truly chosen. She talked about feeling disconnected from herself, about a deep-seated loneliness that no amount of marital contentment could seem to fill. I listened, confused, trying to piece together the puzzle of her words. Had I been a bad husband? Had I not been present enough? I searched my memory for signs I might have missed, for clues that our seemingly happy marriage was a sham. But all I could conjure were images of us laughing at our son's graduation, of holding hands on our anniversary trip to Italy, of her head resting on my shoulder as we watched our daughter in her school play. And then she said the words that shattered my world into a million pieces. "I've fallen in love with someone else." My heart plummeted, a lead weight in my chest. Betrayal, hot and sharp, coursed through my veins. I pictured a younger man from her office, someone with a full head of hair and a six-pack, someone who could offer her the excitement and passion that had perhaps faded from our long-term relationship. I braced myself for the name, for the face that would haunt my dreams for months to come. But the name she gave me wasn't a man's. It was Laura. The name hung in the air, a foreign object in the familiar landscape of our living room. Laura. I knew Laura. She was a friend of Sarah's from her book club, a divorced art teacher with a warm smile and a penchant for brightly colored scarves. They'd been spending a lot of time together lately, going to museums and art galleries, taking long walks in the park. I'd been happy for Sarah, happy that she had a friend who shared her interests, someone she could talk to about things that bored me to tears. I had never, not in a million years, suspected their friendship was anything more than that. "Laura?" I repeated, my voice hoarse. "You're in love with Laura?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "I know it's a lot to take in," she sobbed. "I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt you." But the hurt was already there, a raw, gaping wound in the center of my being. It wasn't just the betrayal of infidelity, it was the utter and complete demolition of my reality. My wife, the woman I had loved and cherished for 2 decades, the mother of my children, was leaving me for a woman. The thought was so absurd, so far outside the realm of my understanding that I almost laughed. It felt like a plot from a bad movie, a storyline so ridiculous it couldn't possibly be happening to me. For the first few days, I existed in a state of numb disbelief. I went to work, I ate meals, I had conversations, but it was all a performance, a pantomime of normalcy. Underneath the surface, I was reeling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of questions and confusion. How could this have happened? When did it start? Was our entire marriage a lie? I replayed every moment of our life together, searching for clues, for any sign that Sarah had been hiding this monumental secret from me. I remembered her occasional comments about a female celebrity being beautiful, her close friendships with other women, her lack of interest in some of the more traditionally masculine things I enjoyed. But these were all just tiny, insignificant details, easily dismissed at the time. They were certainly not enough to build a case for her being a lesbian. The word itself felt strange and foreign in my mouth. Lesbian. It was a word I associated with political activists and Ellen DeGeneres, not with my suburban minivan-driving wife. The first person I told was my best friend, Dave. We'd known each other since college, and he'd been the best man at my wedding. I called him in a daze, my voice a monotone as I recounted the events of that fateful Tuesday night. He was silent for a long moment, and I could hear the shock and confusion in his own voice when he finally spoke. "Are you serious?" he asked, his tone a mixture of disbelief and concern. "She's gay?" The word hung in the air, another label that didn't seem to fit the woman I thought I knew. I spent hours online, searching for answers, for some kind of framework to help me understand what was happening. I read articles about late-in-life lesbians and stories from other men whose wives had left them for women. I found forums filled with heartbroken husbands, their posts a litany of pain, confusion, and anger. Reading their stories was both a comfort and a torment. It was a relief to know that I wasn't alone, that other men had walked this same bewildering path. But it was also terrifying to see my own fears and insecurities in their words. They wrote about feeling emasculated, about questioning their own masculinity and sexual prowess. They wrote about the shame and embarrassment of telling their friends and family, about the pitying looks and awkward silences. And they wrote about the profound sense of betrayal, the feeling that their entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. I started to question everything about our marriage. Was our love real? Were our intimate moments genuine? Or was she just playing a part, going through the motions while secretly fantasizing about being with a woman? The thought was a poison that seeped into every happy memory, tainting it with doubt and suspicion. I confronted Sarah with these questions, my voice raw with a mixture of anger and desperation. She insisted that she had loved me, that our marriage had been real to her. She said she hadn't known she was gay when we got married, that it was a part of herself she had suppressed for so long that she hadn't even been aware of it. She told me that meeting Laura had been like a switch flipping on in a dark room, illuminating a part of her soul that had been hidden for her entire life. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but the hurt and betrayal were too fresh, too raw. How could she not have known? How could she have built a life with me, had children with me, if she was fundamentally attracted to women? It didn't make any sense. The world I had known, the world I had built with Sarah was crumbling around me, and I was powerless to stop it. I felt like a character in a play who had suddenly discovered that the script he'd been following for 20 years was a complete fiction. Every line I'd spoken, every action I'd taken had been based on a false premise. And now the curtain was falling, and I was left standing on an empty stage, alone and utterly lost. I started to withdraw from my friends and family, unable to face their questions and their sympathy. I couldn't bear the thought of telling my parents, of seeing the disappointment and confusion in their eyes. How could I explain to them that their daughter-in-law, the one they had welcomed into their family with open arms, was leaving me for another woman? It felt like a betrayal not just of me, but of our entire family. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of work, sleep, and an all-consuming grief that settled in my bones like a chronic illness. I lost weight, my appetite disappearing along with my will to engage with the world. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the space beside me in the bed a cold, empty chasm that seemed to mock the warmth and intimacy we had once shared. I started to withdraw from my friends and family, unable to face their questions and their sympathy. I couldn't bear the thought of telling my parents, of seeing the disappointment and confusion in their eyes. How could I explain to them that their daughter-in-law, the one they had welcomed into their family with open arms, was leaving me for another woman? It felt like a betrayal not just of me, but of our entire family. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of work, sleep, and an all-consuming grief that settled in my bones like a chronic illness. I lost weight, my appetite disappearing along with my will to engage with the world. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the space beside me in the bed a cold, empty chasm that seemed to mock the warmth and intimacy we had once shared. The house itself became a museum of our shared life, every object a painful reminder of what I had lost. The photographs on the mantelpiece, the mismatched coffee mugs in the cupboard, the worn-out armchair where she used to sit and read. They were all artifacts of a life that no longer existed. I felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of my own happiness. And through it all, there was the constant, gnawing presence of Laura. I would see her car parked in front of Sarah's new apartment, a small, trendy place in a part of town I'd always found pretentious. I would imagine them together, laughing, holding hands, sharing the kind of intimacy that had once been mine alone. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, stabbing sensation in my chest that left me breathless. I was consumed by a jealousy so intense it felt like a sickness. It wasn't just the jealousy of a spurned lover. It was something more complex, more insidious. It was the jealousy of a man who had been replaced, not by a better man, but by a different gender entirely. It made me question my own worth, my own desirability, in a way I had never experienced before. I had always been confident in my masculinity, in my ability to attract and please a woman. But now that confidence was shattered. If I couldn't even keep my own wife interested, what did that say about me as a man? I felt like a failure, a cliché of a husband who had let himself go, who had become boring and predictable. But this wasn't about me being boring or predictable. This was about something much more fundamental, something I couldn't compete with. It was like I had been playing a game my whole life, only to find out that Sarah was on a completely different field, playing a completely different sport. The rules I had been following, the strategies I had been employing, were all meaningless. I had been destined to lose from the very beginning. The worst part was the loneliness. It was a profound, soul-crushing loneliness that went beyond simply being alone. It was the loneliness of a person who has lost their other half, their partner in crime, the one person in the world who truly understood them. Sarah and I had been a team, a unit. We had faced the world together, our lives intertwined in a million different ways. And now that team was disbanded, and I was left to navigate the world on my own. I had friends, I had family, but no one could fill the void that Sarah had left behind. They could offer sympathy and support, but they couldn't understand the unique and bewildering nature of my pain. How could they? My story was a bizarre anomaly, a late-night talk show punchline brought to life. My wife left me for a woman. It was a sentence that still sounded absurd, even in the privacy of my own mind. And so I retreated further into myself, into the cold, empty house that was once a home. I would wander from room to room, a restless spirit trapped in the wreckage of my past. I would pick up old photographs, tracing the lines of Sarah's face with my fingertips, trying to find some hint of the woman she had become, the woman who had been hiding in plain sight for all those years. But all I could see was the woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, the woman who had promised to stand by my side until death did us part. And I would weep, not just for the loss of my wife, but for the loss of the man I used to be, the man who had believed in the simple, uncomplicated narrative of a happy marriage and a life lived according to plan. That man was gone, replaced by a stranger I didn't recognize, a man adrift in a sea of confusion and grief, with no map and no compass to guide him home. The initial shock, that cold, numbing disbelief, eventually began to recede, like a tide going out, leaving behind the jagged, painful rocks of reality. The world, which had been a blurry, out-of-focus mess, slowly started to sharpen, and I was forced to confront the harsh, undeniable truth of my situation. Sarah was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The legal proceedings began, a sterile and soul-crushing process that reduced our 20-year marriage to a series of financial statements and custody agreements. We sat across from each other in a lawyer's office, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. I probably looked even worse. We were two strangers, connected only by the shared history we were now meticulously and painfully dismantling. The division of our assets was a brutal affair. Every object, from the house we had bought as a young, hopeful couple to the mismatched set of wine glasses we'd collected over the years, became a symbol of our failed union. Each item had a story, a memory attached to it, and giving them up felt like amputating a part of myself. The house was the biggest battle. It was the place where we had brought our children home from the hospital, where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where the walls were imbued with the echoes of our laughter and our arguments. I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. But Sarah, or rather her lawyer, argued that she needed a stable home for the kids, even though they were both in college and only home for holidays. The irony was not lost on me. She had been the one to leave, to shatter our family, and now she was claiming the moral high ground as the more stable parent. The custody of our children, Emily and Josh, was another source of pain. They were young adults, technically free to choose where they wanted to live, but the situation was still incredibly difficult for them. They were caught in the middle of a conflict they hadn't asked for, their loyalties torn between the two people they loved most in the world. I tried to be the bigger person, to not put them in a position where they felt they had to choose sides. But it was hard. I wanted them to be angry at their mother, to see her as the villain in this story. But they were just sad, their young faces etched with a confusion and pain that mirrored my own. Emily, our daughter, was more outwardly emotional. She would call me in the middle of the night, sobbing, asking why this was happening, why our family was falling apart. I would try to comfort her, my own voice thick with unshed tears. But what could I say? How could I explain something that I didn't understand myself? Josh, our son, was more stoic, more like me. He would retreat into silence, his jaw tight with an anger he couldn't or wouldn't express. I could see the turmoil in his eyes, the struggle to reconcile the image of the mother he had always known with this new, unfamiliar version. He started spending more time at his college dorm, avoiding coming home, avoiding the suffocating atmosphere of our broken family. The divorce proceedings dragged on for months, a slow, agonizing process that chipped away at my soul. I felt like I was being picked apart, piece by piece, by a system that had no regard for the human cost of its actions. The legal fees were astronomical, draining my savings and adding a layer of financial stress to my already overwhelming emotional burden. During this time, I started to drink more than I should have. It was a way to numb the pain, to quiet the relentless voice in my head that replayed every mistake, every missed opportunity, every moment of our marriage. A few glasses of whiskey in the evening would take the edge off, allowing me to slip into a brief, dreamless oblivion. But the relief was always temporary. I would wake up in the morning with a pounding headache and a renewed sense of despair. The loneliness of the empty house was a constant, oppressive presence. I would come home from work to a dark, silent space that echoed with the absence of my family. I would eat dinner alone, the television blaring to fill the silence, but it was a poor substitute for the warmth of human companionship. The nights were the worst. I would lie in our big, empty bed, the space beside me a cold reminder of Sarah's betrayal. I would toss and turn for hours, my mind a battlefield of angry and self-pitying thoughts. I would imagine her with Laura, sharing the kind of intimacy that was now a distant memory from me. The images were a form of self-torture, but I couldn't seem to stop them. They would flash in my mind vivid and unwelcome, a constant reminder of my failure as a husband and a man. My work began to suffer. I was a partner at a small accounting firm, a job that required focus and attention to detail. But my mind was a fog of grief and anger, and I found it difficult to concentrate on the complex financial reports and tax codes that had once been my bread and butter. My partners were understanding at first, offering their condolences and telling me to take all the time I needed. But as the weeks turned into months, their patience began to wear thin. I could see the concern in their eyes, the worry that my personal problems were affecting the bottom line of the firm. I started to isolate myself even more, avoiding social gatherings and turning down invitations from friends. I couldn't bear the thought of having to explain my situation over and over again, of having to endure the awkward silences and pitying glances. It was easier to just stay home, to wallow in my misery in the privacy of my own home. I was becoming a hermit, a recluse, a man defined by his grief. And then, one day, I hit rock bottom. I had been drinking heavily the night before, and I woke up on the sofa, my head pounding, my mouth dry and tasting of stale whiskey. The house was a mess, empty bottles and pizza boxes scattered around me like the debris of a shipwreck. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, and I was shocked by what I saw. My eyes were bloodshot and sunken, my face pale and gaunt. I had lost at least 20 pounds, and my clothes hung on me like a scarecrow. I looked like a ghost, a shell of the man I used to be. It was in that moment that I realized I couldn't go on like this. I was destroying myself, letting Sarah's actions define me, allowing her to take not just my marriage, but my entire life. I had a choice. I could continue to drown in self-pity and alcohol, or I could fight my way back to the surface. I chose to fight. The first step was to stop drinking. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The cravings were intense, and the temptation to reach for a bottle to numb the pain was always there. But I was determined. I poured all the alcohol in the house down the drain, a symbolic act of cleansing and renewal. I started to exercise, going for long runs in the morning, pushing my body to its limits. The physical exertion was a welcome release, a way to burn off the anger and frustration that had been building inside me for months. I would run until my lungs burned and my legs ached, and for a little while, the physical pain would overshadow the emotional pain. I also started to eat better, to take care of my body. I rediscovered my love for cooking, something I hadn't done in years. I would spend hours in the kitchen, experimenting with new recipes. The simple act of creating something nourishing and delicious, a form of therapy. And slowly, very slowly, I started to feel a glimmer of hope. It was a faint, fragile thing, but it was there. I started to reconnect with my friends, forcing myself to go out and socialize, even when I didn't feel like it. I told them I was ready to talk, to share my story, and they listened with a patience and compassion that I will never forget. I also started to see a therapist, something I had always been resistant to in the past. But I knew I couldn't get through this alone. I needed professional help, someone who could give me the tools and strategies to cope with my grief and anger. My therapist, a kind and insightful woman named Dr. Evans, helped me to see that my feelings were valid, that my anger and sadness were a normal reaction to a traumatic event. She taught me that it was okay to grieve, but it was not okay to let that grief consume me.
She helped me to understand that Sarah's coming out was not a reflection of my worth as a man or a husband. It was about her own journey, her own struggle with her identity. It was a difficult concept to accept, but gradually I started to see the truth in it. It wasn't that I wasn't good enough for her. It was that I was the wrong gender for her. It was a subtle but important distinction, one that allowed me to let go of some of the self-blame and shame that had been weighing me down. The divorce was finally finalized, a thick stack of papers that officially ended our 20-year marriage. There was no sense of relief, no feeling of closure, just a profound sadness for what we had lost, for the life we had built together that was now just a collection of legal documents. But with the divorce came a sense of finality, a clear line in the sand that allowed me to start looking forward instead of backward. I started to rebuild my life, one small step at a time. I redecorated the house, painting over the warm, inviting yellow with a cool, calming blue. I bought new furniture, a sleek, modern sofa to replace the old, worn-out one that was filled with memories of Sarah. I was creating a new space, a space that was mine and mine alone. I also started to focus on my career again, pouring my energy into my work with a renewed sense of purpose. My partners were relieved to see the old Mark back, the sharp, focused accountant they had always known. And I was relieved to feel a sense of competence and control in at least one area of my life. The pain was still there, a dull ache in the background of my life. There were still days when the grief would wash over me, triggered by a song on the radio or a familiar scent in the air. But the waves were less frequent now, less intense. I was learning to ride them, to not let them pull me under. I was starting to see that my life was not over. It was just different. I was a single man in my late 40s, a prospect that was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating.
I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted, to be whoever I wanted to be. The future was a blank canvas, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. I was a survivor, a man who had been through the fire and had come out the other side, scarred but not broken. And I was ready to start the next chapter of my life, a chapter that I would write on my own terms. The process of rebuilding a life from the ashes of a 20-year marriage is not a linear one. There are days of progress, of feeling strong and optimistic, followed by days of regression, of being blindsided by a wave of grief so powerful it knocks you off your feet. It's a messy, unpredictable journey, a dance of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I had started to create a new routine for myself, a life that was centered around my work, my health, and my reconnecting with friends. I was feeling more like myself, more in control of my own destiny. But the ghost of my past life still lingered, a constant reminder of what I had lost. The most difficult part of this new reality was navigating my relationship with Sarah. We were no longer husband and wife, but we were still parents, and we had to find a way to co-parent our 2 young adult children. It was a delicate and often painful dance, a constant negotiation of boundaries and expectations. We would talk on the phone, our conversations stilted and formal, strictly limited to the logistics of our children's lives. We would discuss holiday plans, college tuition payments, and their summer travel arrangements. It was all so bizarrely normal, so utterly surreal. Here we were, 2 people who had once shared the most intimate details of our lives, now reduced to a series of business-like transactions. There were times when the old dynamic would resurface, a brief moment of familiarity in the vast, unfamiliar landscape of our new relationship. She would ask about my work, or I would ask about her mother's health. And for a fleeting second, it would feel like nothing had changed. But then the reality would crash back down, and the awkward silence would descend once again. The elephant in the room was always Laura. Sarah would mention her name casually, as if she were just another friend, but the sound of it would send a jolt of pain through me. I would try to remain impassive, to not let her see how much it hurt, but my jaw would clench and my voice would tighten. I didn't want to hear about Laura. I didn't want to know about their life together. It was a form of self-preservation, a way to protect myself from the images that would inevitably flood my mind. But Sarah, perhaps in an attempt to be open and honest, would sometimes offer up details I didn't want to hear. She would talk about a trip they had taken, a restaurant they had tried, a funny thing that had happened to them. And each detail was like a tiny dagger in my heart. The children were a constant source of both comfort and pain. I loved them more than anything in the world, and their presence in my life was a lifeline. But they were also a living, breathing reminder of the family we had once been. Seeing them with their mother, watching them interact with Laura was a new and exquisite form of torture. The first time I met Laura as Sarah's partner was at Emily's college graduation. I had dreaded this moment for months, my stomach churning with anxiety at the thought of it. We all went out for a celebratory dinner, a strained and awkward affair. Laura was perfectly pleasant, her smile warm and her conversation engaging. She was everything you would want in a friend's new partner. But she wasn't just a friend's new partner. She was the woman who had replaced me, the woman who was now sharing a life with the woman I had loved for 2 decades. I tried to be civil, to make small talk, but every word felt like a betrayal of myself. I was sitting there across the table from the two of them, a ghost at my own family's feast. The most painful part was watching Sarah with her. She was different, more relaxed, more herself than I had ever seen her. There was a lightness about her, a joy that I hadn't realized was missing until I saw it in its full, radiant glory. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had never been able to make her that happy. It was a devastating realization, one that forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that our marriage, as happy as I had thought it was, had been built on a foundation of her unhappiness. After that dinner, I spiraled into a depression that was deeper and darker than anything I had experienced before. The progress I had made, the fragile sense of hope I had been nurturing, all of it seemed to vanish overnight. I felt like a fraud, a man who was just pretending to be okay, when in reality, he was broken and empty inside. I started to question everything again. Was I a fool for not seeing it sooner? Was I so blind, so self-absorbed, that I had missed the signs of my own wife's misery? The self-doubt was a relentless, corrosive force, eating away at my already fragile self-esteem. I retreated back into my shell, avoiding social contact and losing myself in the familiar, numbing embrace of work. I was existing, but I wasn't living. I was a man going through the motions, my heart a cold, hard nut in my chest. And then something unexpected happened. I got a call from Josh, my son. He was home from college for the weekend, and he wanted to have dinner, just the two of us. It was a rare occurrence. Josh was a typical college student, more interested in his friends and his social life than in spending time with his old man. We went to a small, quiet restaurant, a place where we could talk without being overheard. He was quiet at first, pushing his food around his plate, much like his mother had done on that fateful night so many months ago. And then he looked at me, his eyes filled with a maturity and understanding that belied his years. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I need you to be okay." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been so wrapped up in my own pain that I hadn't fully considered the impact it was having on my children. They had lost their family, their sense of security, and now they were watching their father fall apart. It was a wake-up call, a much-needed jolt of reality. I realized that my self-pity was not just self-destructive, it was selfish. I had a responsibility to my children, a responsibility to be a strong, stable presence in their lives, especially now when their world had been turned upside down. That night, something shifted in me. I made a conscious decision to let go of the anger and the bitterness. It was a poison that was not only destroying me, but it was also hurting the people I loved most. I started to focus on the future, on creating a new life for myself, a life that was not defined by my past. I started to date again,
a terrifying and exhilarating experience. The world of dating had changed dramatically in the 20 years I had been married. There were apps and websites, a whole new set of rules and etiquette to learn. My first few dates were awkward and stilted. I felt like a teenager again, nervous and unsure of myself. I was rusty, out of practice, and my confidence was still shaky. But I persisted. I met a woman named Karen, a high school teacher with a quick wit and a kind heart. She was divorced too, and she understood the pain and the challenges of starting over. We had dinner, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of connection with someone new. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a start. It was a reminder that there was life after Sarah, that there was the possibility of happiness and intimacy with someone else. My relationship with Sarah also began to change. I started to see her not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as a person who had been struggling with her own identity, her own truth. I started to feel a sense of compassion for her, for the years she had spent living a life that was not authentic to her. It wasn't an easy process. There were still moments of anger, of resentment, but they were fewer and farther between. I was starting to heal, to find a sense of peace with what had happened. I even started to have civil conversations with Laura. We would run into each other at family gatherings, and we would make small talk, our interactions no longer fraught with the tension and hostility that had once defined them. I saw that she made Sarah happy, and as much as it pained me to admit it, I wanted Sarah to be happy. She was still the mother of my children, and we were still connected by a bond that could never be broken.
The journey was far from over. There were still scars, deep and permanent reminders of the pain I had endured. But I was no longer defined by those scars. I was a man who was learning to live with them, to accept them as a part of my story, but not the whole story. I was starting to write a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope and possibility, a chapter where I was the author of my own destiny. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what the future held. The years that followed were a gradual, almost imperceptible journey of healing and self-discovery. The sharp, stabbing pain of betrayal had faded into a dull ache, a phantom limb that would sometimes throb with a memory, but no longer had the power to incapacitate me. Life had settled into a new rhythm, a new normal that I had painstakingly crafted for myself. My relationship with Karen blossomed. It was different from my marriage to Sarah, less about the all-consuming passion of youth and more about the quiet comfort of shared companionship. We were two people who had been through the ringer, who had the scars to prove it, and who had found solace and understanding in each other. We didn't try to replicate what we had lost. We built something new, something that was uniquely ours. We traveled, we took up new hobbies, we laughed. Karen taught me how to salsa dance, and I taught her how to appreciate the subtle complexities of a good single malt scotch. We were a good team, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace and contentment. My relationship with my children also deepened. With the raw emotional turmoil of the divorce behind us, we were able to connect on a new level. They were adults now, with lives and careers of their own, and I was no longer just their father. I was their friend, their confidant. We would have long, honest conversations about their fears and their dreams, about their relationships and their struggles. And in those conversations, I saw the incredible, resilient human beings they had become. They had navigated the wreckage of their parents' divorce with a grace and maturity that I could only admire. The most surprising transformation, however, was in my relationship with Sarah. The anger and bitterness had long since dissipated, replaced by a quiet, resigned acceptance. We had found a way to be friends, a strange, new kind of family, bound together by our shared love for our children. We would have dinner together a few times a year, the four of us, me and Karen, Sarah, and Laura. The first time we did it, it was awkward and strange, a social experiment that felt doomed to fail. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. We started to talk, to laugh, to share stories. And for a brief, surreal moment, it felt like we were just four old friends, catching up on old times. I learned a lot about Sarah in those years.
I learned about the struggle she had faced, the years she had spent feeling like a fraud, the immense guilt she had carried for the pain she had caused me and the children. I saw her not as a monster, but as a human being, flawed and complicated, who had made a difficult and courageous choice to live her truth. I also learned a lot about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I ever thought possible. I learned that I was capable of forgiveness, not just of Sarah, but of myself. I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I ever thought possible. I learned that I was capable of forgiveness, not just of Sarah, but of myself. I had made mistakes in our marriage. I had been complacent. I had taken her for granted. I had not been a perfect husband, and I had to accept my own role in the breakdown of our relationship. One evening, Sarah and I were having coffee, just the two of us. The kids were out of town, and Karen was at a book club meeting. We were talking about our lives, about the strange and unexpected paths they had taken. And then she looked at me, her eyes filled with a sad, gentle honesty. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry for the way I hurt you." It was a simple, unadorned apology, but it was the one I had been waiting for all those years. And in that moment, I felt the last vestiges of my anger and resentment melt away. "I know," I said, and I meant it. We sat in silence for a long time, the comfortable, easy silence of two people who had shared a lifetime of history, of love, and of pain. And in that silence, I felt a profound sense of closure, a feeling that the final chapter of our story had finally been written. My life now is a world away from the one I had imagined for myself all those years ago. It's not the life I had planned, but it's a good life, a full life, a life filled with love and laughter and a hard-won wisdom. I am a man who has been to the darkest depths of despair and has found his way back to the light. I am a man who has learned that love can be found in the most unexpected of places, that forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself, and that the end of one story is often just the beginning of another. The world is a much more complex and nuanced place than I had ever realized. It's not a world of black and white, of heroes and villains. It's a world of gray, a world where people are just trying to find their way, to find their truth, to find their happiness. And sometimes, in that search, they cause pain, not out of malice, but out of a desperate human need to be whole. I still think about Sarah sometimes, about the 20 years we spent together, about the life we built and the family we raised. And I am grateful for those years, for the love we shared, for the children we brought into the world. Our marriage may have ended, but the love, in its own way, will always be there. It has just transformed into something new, something different, something that I am still trying to understand. And that's okay. Because I have learned that life is not about having all the answers. It's about learning to live with the questions, to embrace the uncertainty, to find the beauty in the messy, unpredictable, and often painful journey of being human. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I am finally on the right path, a path that is not defined by my past, but by the infinite possibilities of the future. A future that I am ready to embrace, with an open heart and a renewed sense of hope. Now that you've heard what I went through, I'd love to hear from you. What's the one choice you made in a painful moment that ended up changing your life for the better? Comment below, and make sure to subscribe to Reddit Whispers.